Welcome to the Parties channel. Today we explain Genesis chapter 50 in a clear and simple way, step by step. We've actually reached the grand finale of the book of Genesis. It's a chapter that beautifully ties up some really heavy themes: mourning, ultimate forgiveness, and God's long-term promises. We're going to stay right in the text, exactly as it's written in the Hebrew Tanakh, looking at the literal events. We want to know exactly who's doing what, where they are, and why it all matters. Here is our roadmap for chapter 50. First, we'll set the context and start the walkthrough. Then we follow Jacob's massive funeral procession. After that, we dive into the brothers' great fear, followed by Joseph's powerful forgiveness. We'll look at Joseph's final days, and finally wrap up with some key ideas and lessons. All right, let's jump straight into section 1. Context, and our walkthrough begins. So, just to quickly set the stage, we're picking up literally right after the death of the patriarch Jacob in Egypt. He's given his final blessings to his sons, and he has drawn his last breath. And what's really striking about these opening verses is the raw emotion. In verse 1, it says, Joseph threw himself upon his father and wept over him and kissed him. You can really feel that deep, personal grief, right? But then watch what happens in verse 2. Joseph has to immediately pivot back to being this powerful leader in Egypt. He directs the physicians to embalm his father, Israel. It's a fascinating shift from a son's intense mourning to the very practical, physical preparations of a state leader. Now, verse 3 gives us some incredibly specific timelines. It says the physicians took a full 40 days because that was the exact amount of time required for the Egyptian embalming process. And then the Egyptians actually mourned for him for 70 days. To put that into perspective, this is an immense level of respect. Remember, Jacob was a Hebrew shepherd, a foreigner, but because he's the father of Joseph, the ruler of Egypt, he's basically given a royal state funeral and a full national mourning period. Moving on to section 2, we covered Jacob's funeral procession, which takes us through verses 1 to 14. So the 70-day mourning period is over. Now Joseph has to navigate royal protocol to keep a very specific promise. Jacob had made Joseph swear an oath, "Do not bury me in Egypt, take me back to the land of Canaan." In verses 4 and 5, Joseph approaches Pharaoh's court. He explains this solemn oath about the tomb his father dug in Canaan. And verse 6 shows us that Pharaoh completely honors the request. He tells Joseph, "Go up and bury your father as he made you swear to do." It's a big deal that Pharaoh lets his right-hand man leave the country for this. And this brings us to the actual journey in verses 7 through 9. Guys, this wasn't just a quiet little family trip. The text specifically tells us that all of Pharaoh's officials went with him, the dignitaries of his court, the dignitaries of Egypt, plus Joseph's entire household and his brothers. They even had chariots and horsemen. It's a massive diplomatic and military procession. The only ones left behind in the region of Goshen were the little children and the flocks. As they travel, this vast company reaches the threshing floor of Atad, right near the Jordan River. And here, in verses 10 and 11, they pause. They lament loudly and bitterly for a full 7 days. The sheer scale of this loud mourning was so intense that it permanently changed the map. The local Canaanites watched this and said, the Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning. And because of that, the place was named Abel Mizraim. In biblical Hebrew, Mizraim means Egypt. So Abel Mizraim literally translates to mourning of the Egyptians. After that intense week of mourning, verses 12 and 13 confirm that Jacob's sons did exactly what he commanded. They carried him into Canaan and laid him to rest in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre. This is absolutely crucial, because this is the exact same burial place Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite generations ago to bury Sarah. They are tying their history right back to Abraham. Having completed this solemn duty to the letter, verse 14 tells us Joseph and the entire massive company head back to Egypt. That brings us to section 3, the brothers' great fear, found in verses 15 through 18. You see, in the brothers' minds, Jacob was the glue holding this whole fragile piece together. With him dead, deep, unresolved panic starts to set in. Look at verse 15. When they realize their father is truly gone, they ask themselves, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? They are terrified. They're assuming Joseph's kindness was just a temporary act to avoid upsetting their aging dad, and now that Jacob is out of the picture, they fully expect the hammer to fall. So what's their game plan? In verses 16 and 17, they send a message to Joseph, claiming that before Jacob died, he left strict instructions for them to ask Joseph for forgiveness for their sins. Then, in verse 18, their panic hits a boiling point. They physically come to Joseph, throw themselves face down on the ground, and just say, "We are your slaves." They're literally, preemptively surrendering their freedom, offering to be his slaves just to avoid his righteous wrath. Let's see how Joseph handles this in Section 4, Joseph's Forgiveness, covering verses 19 through 21. When Joseph gets that message begging for mercy, the text tells us at the end of verse 17 that he wept. It clearly broke his heart that after all these years, they still didn't trust him. So his reaction in verses 19 through 21 is just one of the most profound moments in the entire text. He speaks softly to them and says, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" It's a complete, total rejection of vengeance. He recognizes that ultimate judgment belongs strictly to God, and there is no way he's going to use his political power to settle an old personal score. And then we get to verse 20. This verse beautifully distills the core theology of the entire chapter, maybe the whole Joseph narrative. He tells them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Notice, he doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't deny that what they did was evil, but he's showing them that human malice was completely repurposed by divine providence. God's plan to ensure survival during the famine was so much bigger than their jealousy. Joseph doesn't just leave it at high-level theology either. In verse 21, he turns that truth into practical action. He says, "So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." These aren't empty words. He is making a concrete, real-world commitment to keep them alive and fed in Egypt. He reassures them, he speaks kindly to them, and he fully heals that family fracture through active, ongoing care. Now we move to Section 5, Joseph's Final Days. This covers verses 22 through 26. Verses 22 and 23 note that Joseph stayed in Egypt with all his father's family, and he lived to be 110 years old. Now that's a very specific, important detail, because in ancient Egypt, 110 years was considered the absolute ideal, highly blessed lifespan. He lived long enough to hold his great-grandchildren. The text specifically mentions he saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, and the children of Machar, son of Manasseh, were even placed at birth on his knees. It's a picture of a life full of deep, generational fulfillment. But eventually, Joseph's time comes too. In verse 24, the dying Joseph gives his brothers a final, unshakable prophecy. He tells them, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Think about that. He is the second most powerful man in Egypt, yet he's assuring his family that Egypt is not their permanent home. Their future belongs entirely to the Promised Land. Because he is so absolutely certain of this, verse 25 details a very specific request. Joseph makes the sons of Israel swear an oath. He says, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place." He's securing a strict promise, perfectly mirroring the exact oath he made to his own father, Jacob. Joseph wants his physical remains to be a part of the future redemption of his people. And so, verse 26 brings this chapter, and really the entire book of Genesis, to a close. It simply states, "So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt." It's a bit of a cliffhanger, right? Verse 26 leaves the Israelites waiting in Egypt, pausing the literal history right there, with Joseph resting in a coffin, waiting for the day God would finally call them out. Finally, Section 6, Key Ideas and Lessons. This chapter isn't just ancient history. It's packed with straightforward, practical life lessons on how we can improve ourselves today. First, we see the immense power of releasing grudges completely. Joseph literally had every worldly right to exact revenge, but he actively chose peace. Second, we learn how crucial it is to trust in a larger, providential plan, to believe that God can take our deepest hardships and flip them into something that sustains life. Third, the text highlights the absolute importance of honoring family oaths, just like Joseph did for Jacob and asked for himself. And finally, we learn about repaying past wrongs, not just with passive tolerance, but with active kindness. Joseph promised to feed the very brothers who once sold him into slavery. This leaves us with a final, provocative thought to ponder as the book of Genesis closes. Awaiting the promise. Will the Israelites actually remember Joseph's bones when the time finally comes to leave Egypt? You'll have to keep reading the text to find out. Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.